All right, good morning. Welcome to Sunday Civics. My name's Tom Christie, best hour of my week. I hope it is for you. We've done 3 segments already on what's called bail reform, but crime and what's the problem. And we're never going to eliminate crime. It's been with us forever, but we do want to understand it better. And this thing called bail reform seems to be legitimate, of a concern. And maybe I'm overthinking it all the time, but just last week, a guy plowed his car into a Christmas celebration, into a parade. Horrible thing. We'll find out he's out on parole for, or bail thing for $1,000 for multiple horrible accounts. It just, since we're talking about this all the time, that seemed like this. So anyway, in an effort to know more, we always want to talk about it. So I almost call you my co-host, Angelo Morinello, Assemblyman Angelo Morinello, because he's been kind enough to come and help me learn this subject, talk through it with guests who may know more than me for sure, maybe even than himself. So I can't thank him enough. And Angelo's up in the corner.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Tom, what I'd like to do is introduce Stacy, but what I'd like to state is our focus this morning is going to be on domestic violence and how the bail reform has a cause and effect on victims of domestic violence. And until you understand the true aspects of domestic violence, it's very hard to discuss the bail reform as it pertains to domestic violence. And so, like you said, we try and educate. And this morning, I was kind enough for Stacy Seuss to be able to volunteer to come in. And she is the Victim Service Coordinator for Domestic Violence Intervention and Services for the Niagara County Sheriff's Department. And she is going to share with us some of the aspects of domestic violence so that as we go forward dealing with bail reform, we can understand why this is an area that has to be addressed separately than the general concept of crime and bail reform. So with that, good morning, Stacy. And if you would like to begin, it's your show, and I will jump in when I can. Well, it's Tom's show.
It's Mike Reed's show. It's not.
That's right. We're just pushing you out, Tom. That's all.
Angelo and Stacy, thank you for coming, Stacy. But can you just start with telling me what domestic violence is? I mean, let's start there.
Of course. Sure. New York State doesn't have a per se definition, but they do have information in the penal code that describes domestic violence as a familial relationship, excuse me, with brothers, sisters, parents, children, next of kin, anybody assigned by the court, those that are married, formally married, have children in common, or have been intimate partners. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to live together, but it is a relationship that is developed, right? So anybody that does file police reports, the police are required to put that on a domestic incident report. So here in Niagara County, we get roughly 3,500 domestic incident reports every year.
A year. Okay. What is that? I do the math. That's a bunch a week, right? I mean, how long have you been doing this?
I've been a victim advocate for 10 years now.
Do you take it home with you? I don't mean that's a bad choice of words, but I mean, doesn't that get into, I don't know. I don't know how a cancer doctor goes to work every day, because how do you go to work and I don't know, it's a lot of load on your shoulders.
It definitely is, but there are tools that we now have in place that are available to us to assist victims. It's difficult to hear things like bail reform that have happened when they don't have the input of the local domestic violence offices about the implications of that bail reform and how negatively it affects our work, and that will ultimately hinder victims from going forward in the future.
What seems to me to be an issue of bail reform is domestic violence occurs. Someone calls, the police show up, they take the person away. They separate the people at least. If it was very serious, a cooling off period is very essential. You're in jail for a night, a week, however long it takes. Now, if you let the other person out almost within the hour, there's no cooling off period. You know where the people live. You go right back home and nobody's safe again. Is that a fear?
Yeah. Tom,
That's
Tom, may I interject at this
Yeah.
point? You asked, what is bail reform? I mean, what is domestic violence? But I think I want to get, if I can get a little bit into the minutia of domestic violence. Domestic violence is a learned behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It is something that they take, that the abuser wants to exercise power and control over the victim. And many, many times that power and control doesn't always take the form of violence or physical. It can be mental, it could be financial, it could be isolation from family. So there are many aspects to it. But the important thing that we need to remember in this discussion is it is a learned behavior. And one of the functions is to take power and control away from the abuser and put it in the hands of a higher being the judge in these instances. And as I started out, we have to understand those nuances before we can actually understand why there should be a total exception to complete judicial discretion when it comes to a domestic violence incident. Stacy, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut in, but
you're absolutely, Assemblyman. I agree with you. There is a deep hold that abusers hold over their victims, and it's not always seen by everybody else. It is that emotional, it's terrifying isolation, it's traumatization behind closed doors, that people are fearful of the defendant who seems very appropriate when they're in public. They seem like they're the perfect gentleman and are excellent at manipulating the community and the people around them. And it instills this fear into the household where people are, seemingly have some psychological characteristics that are shown to the police when they show up, and they seem like they're the ones that have the issue. And it's very difficult to get cases prosecuted when the defendant is right back out of custody, within hours back in the household, sometimes with a limited order of protection, and that victim feels helpless. There's nothing that they can do because bail reform.
Okay, so that all you have described was perfect over all of history until you said bail reform. So how has it changed with bail reform? We've actually increased the odds of letting that person back in the household quicker? Is that what bail reform has done since you've seen it? Did this happen on December 19th, 2019, or whenever the law took effect? You saw a spike in issues?
Absolutely. There's always been issues. There's always been a sometimes short period of time between the defendant's arrest and arraignment. Like that has always been an issue, but never to this extent, not within hours. Sometimes we're not able to get a hold of victims because they're still in the hospital when the defendant's getting released. Like that's how serious some of these domestic violence cases are. They can release them on task or monitoring. And frankly, there's just not enough monitors to go around. So I don't know how feasible that solution could be. And put in writing, it sounds great, but it doesn't function.
Stacey, I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you like the last person at the end of the totem pole where, the assemblymen and senators and the governor made this rule? Somebody kind of knew about it all along, but you show up at work one day and see that it passed. I mean, you weren't consulted all along. You weren't, we're all busy, but this was something that hit you after it was already law, I bet.
That's correct. Yes.
And after you saw this,
we heard it was coming, but there was no discussion about who the people in the trenches it affects. And, personally, the stories that we hear answer calls on the struggles that people are going through, that information was not asked of us.
Tom, I
Yes.
don't know if you know, I was the assigned domestic violence judge in Niagara Falls for a period of 10 years. And during that time, I went through many trainings. But where you just mentioned about the not being consulted with. When bail reform was being discussed, I focused on the domestic violence part of it. And I actually called a lot of advocates. Then I called the head of the advocacy group in Albany. And here was the answer I was given. Well, I don't want to take a stand because it might affect budgetary concerns. I have advocated to have that person removed because the budgets would have covered her organization because of the need for it. But to be given that kind of an answer from the head of the New York State Domestic Violence Advocacy Association or group, I forget what the title was, to me was very disconcerting. But her failure to chime in on just facts, not screaming we don't need bail reform, and that's not what we're talking about, but how maybe each individual area needed to be looked at. I think she could have done it. So it took another year of advocacy after it was passed to at least get a couple of minor adjustments to it, but still nowhere near what is necessary to put discretion back in the hands of justice. Stacey, I'm sorry for keeping the jump in, but because I had to live with it in Albany, okay?
Sure.
And I had to listen and I had to debate these issues. And I will only debate issues that I know about. And after 10 years, I felt I knew quite a bit about domestic violence.
See, you could never do my job here because I'll talk about anything I don't know anything about.
Okay.
We're exactly the opposite. I'll do the exact opposite. But let me ask this. I was in Albany for a long time, and it was unfortunately the case that a Republican in the assembly meant nothing, and a Democrat in the Senate meant nothing. You could complain or have as much logic as possible. You could call Stacey to Albany to testify before the governor, and it didn't matter because it was a fait accompli of whatever the Democrats in the assembly decided and the Republicans in the Senate decided. It didn't matter the logic of people who had to implement the law. So I don't exonerate you in anything. I don't need to. Who am I to do that? But I mean, you can raise as many questions as you want, and sometimes deaf ears in Albany. I think that's still the case, right?
Well, it is. It's even more pronounced because what the example you gave, at least there was balance between the Senate and the Assembly, and there had to be compromise. Where now it is one party rule. I'm fortunate, though, I do get a voice on certain issues. I may have to move them to a majority member, but I've learned that you can't just beat the drum. What you have to do is be logical and find a vehicle or a way of accomplishing the needs that are there. And that's what happened on this. And, some of the changes I feel that I was finally listened to, but not enough.
Yeah. Now, in the legislation, I would assume that Stacey could do her job if the budget for psychological training and other domestic violence services was increased exponentially. So we're going to let people out sooner, but they're going to go to places where they get help. That didn't happen, right? There was no increase in service ability. It was just let them out, right? Type of thing, right?
Correct.
And so, Stacey, how do you deal with that? Because I would think you see the same people a lot of the time. Is that the case too?
Repeat offenders?
Yeah.
Yes.
You know who people are throughout the community. I mean, that's the case with most things.
Right. Niagara County is not a huge community. So we handle every police report in the entire county. So we do see when they're traveling from, say, Lockport to Lewiston or, any North Tonawanda, whatever. I do see multiple victims, repeat offenders continuously. But, it's important to remember that the services were not, as you said, given funding after this reform was put in place for, again, more monitors, more task programs, drug programs, all the things that you offer defendants after they commit offenses in lieu of going to jail for conviction, those things are not increased in funding. So there is a, what do you call it? A balloon of new clients on these other agencies, not to mention there's not more funding given to domestic violence. There's not more shelter space. You know, COVID has done a number on that as well. Even people that are leaving and trying to seek help, there's not enough beds here in Niagara County. Even if we go out to other counties, there's not enough beds. So, you know, that being said, people are planning and we're helping them safety plan in different ways. That's how it's affecting us.
Good question, because you have to solve the problem whether you're giving them any more funding or not. How do
Absolutely.
you help the victim? Because you have to help the victim. How do you help the victim with less funding and more victims?
We have to try and get a hold of them almost immediately. So we've reached out to the district attorney's office to gain access to crime victims faster, if that makes sense. Like, we get police reports, we get call outs, that sort of thing. But our thought is to get a hold of victims before the defendant gets home.
You know, domestic violence is not necessarily an economic problem. You know, it's not just the poor people that do this. You see bankers and lawyers, just to pick a group. This is, everybody can be an abuser.
Everybody.
Do we used to lock up the bankers and lawyers though? I mean, you know, and throw away the key type of thing. I mean, bail reform doesn't seem to have had an effect over, you know, privileged as opposed to the underprivileged.
No, it doesn't. That bail was put in place to guarantee or ensure that people come back to court, right? That's really the purpose of it. I have seen many, many, many cases prior to bail reform given bail for cooling off period. There is proven fact that escalation of violence happens when there's a separation in the relationship, and bail can de-escalate the risk of violence, period, regardless of any economic status. Like, it doesn't matter if bail was set. In any case, you would at least have that period of time for the additional cooling off.
Maybe, Assemblyman, maybe you can answer this, but domestic violence, I would imagine all incidents are not created equal. Maybe somebody did just have a bad moment and it was a one-off, and maybe somebody is a lifetime abuser and horrible. Like, what are the gradations of keeping, of knowing and applying? Okay. Does a judge know this? Like, if this happened to me, am I brought up before a judge or taken to the police station? I don't even know how the water works through the system.
Well, initially, let's talk before bail reform when I was on the bench. If there was a domestic violence call, sometimes it might be a neighbor who finally called because they heard, or a family member, or the victim themselves. The person would be arrested. And there was 7-day arraignment. So the most somebody would stay in without an arraignment might be an overnight. And we had sessions on holidays, et cetera, for arraignments. The judge would have the fact pattern in front of them of that particular incident, but they would also have what's called a nisus, which is the criminal history and the criminal record. In addition, you would be able to, the advocates were always there to give some insight into the history. So yes, a judge would have the ability to assess the degree of danger based upon, as you said, a bad moment, an argument, but not a history of it. And in those instances, you might have some other conditions, like there's a full stay away order of protection, and then there's a limited order. So you might put a limited order of protection in one of those cases, which is refrain from harassing, stalking, menacing, etc. So you can still cohabit in those instances, but there was something that could be held as contempt if it was violated. The full stay away order, of course, was stay away from the home, school, business, place of employment, no direct or indirect contact, no third party contact, etc. So a judge would first of all, in order to be the assigned domestic violence judge, there's a series of trainings that we had to go through, both state and federal trainings, that would explain to you what the basis and what the domestic violence actually is, and not just a definition of domestic violence. And I'll be the first to admit that my first couple of weeks on the bench, I didn't understand the nuances of it, okay? And I probably made a couple decisions that maybe I would have made differently had I had all the training I had. So yes, the judge is in one of the best positions, but if you tie the judge's hand and limit them, even on a contempt, to an order of protection. I've never seen a paper order of protection stop a fist or a bullet. I've never seen an electronic monitor that monitors the movements. Well, by the time you monitor the movement, those that are overseeing it, there could be a death. They could, the abuser can move about much more quickly than the monitor can to then go and try and stop that person. So, like I said, the issue becomes one of, we should form a wall around domestic violence concept and give judge unfettered discretion in those cases, because what we're talking about is the abuser that the bail reform is trying to protect, but nobody's talking about the victim, and the victim is the party, and the victim. Go on, Tom. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, you said before bail reform. So after bail reform, 1 to 7 days, you said, I'll get arraigned if this happened to me. What happened with bail reform?
With bail reform, the first round was basically you give an appearance ticket. So the police show up at the home. There's a misdemeanor violation. You give an appearance ticket and you leave. So you leave the two parties together.
Same crime. I was not arrested. I was just given a ticket.
Same crime, and they walk away. So now they would bring them before a judge, but the judge has to give the least restrictive means of returning, not the least restrictive means of ensuring protection of the victim. Okay.
Wait, when I get my ticket, when I'm arrested, you take me. You're in control.
Right.
When you give me a ticket, I'm already a scofflaw. I'm already somebody who doesn't pay attention to tickets, and I'm already somebody who hits people. I mean, I'm probably not showing up.
Correct. But if you don't show up, then you can put out a warrant, but you still have to have a history of that. So each case is different. But the problem is there's so many variables. Like they say, well, now if there's contempt, you can put electronic monitoring, as Stacy mentioned. First of all, there's no money, so we're short of electronic monitoring instruments, the ankle bracelet, okay? There's nothing to be able to stop somebody from taking it off and going and committing a more heinous act. In order of protection, some people will abide by it, but like I said, it won't stop a fist or a bullet or a baseball bat.
Well, this is a mental illness thing. I mean, you can't legislate mental illness.
Well, it's I don't know if it's mental illness is almost, if it was mental illness, I think we would look at it differently. It is a learned behavior. And so what you have to do is untrain the individual. And how do you do it? As I said earlier in this segment, you take the power and control away from the abuser. And how do you do that? The judge has the ultimate discretion of holding them in jail if for the safety of the victim or the safety of the community, because many times it's happened in the past that the abuser, for retaliation, will go to a public location where the victim is and not only injure or kill the victim, but they've been known to kill other innocent parties in there. So like I say, it's a learned behavior, power and control. And the key is to take the power and control away from the abuser. And the only one that should have that authority is the judge.
I guess I don't want to belabor this point, but learned behavior and mental illness, I guess I'm foggy on the distinction, because who did I learn it from? Again, it's all about me. Like, say I did this. Who did I learn this from?
All right. The difference is this: a mental illness is a deficiency, and there's many ways of getting the mental illness. Okay, it could be chemical imbalance in your receptors. or it could be just a true mental illness. Abusers do not have a mental illness. They just have a power and control, a power grab. We've seen this with politicians where they assume their power is greater than it is. And the voters can take that power away by unelecting them or not electing them in the next term. So as Stacy was shaking her head, it is not a mental illness. I'm sorry, Stacy. Go on, please.
It's a choice. It's a choice.
Yes, it's a
Stacey,
choice.
Are there one of you or 100 of you? Like, we must be underfunded. There must not be many people to handle the overflow and influx of this problem, right?
Absolutely. There's 6 of us in Niagara County.
And do you have a caseload that is probably more than you can possibly handle, even
Yes.
before bail reform?
Yes, we have to prioritize based on the new information that comes out, and we work the best we can with what we have. So I wanted to go back about the order protection violations with judiciary discretion. Without judges having the ability to violate somebody or post bail, even, let me step back. If a order of protection is violated, it doesn't mean that the defendant will get bail. Based on what their criminal charges will still determine what their bail amount is. So it escalates and it amps up the defendant to believe that they are most powerful and nothing's going to happen to them. There aren't any real consequences for the defendant when they break a violation, depending on what that criminal charge is. So it sends a message to the victim that their trauma is not valid, their concerns are not valid, and judges' hands are tied. They really can't give, a complete answer. We're left to explain to victims why bail reform exists and why it has affected their safety so poorly.
Angela, are judges' hands tied? I mean, you can't give, that Jeffrey Dahmer just came before you. That's not a good example. That wasn't domestic violence, but the person that came before you, because you're from this community, should never see the light of day right now. Certainly not go home to his children. You can't set bail at $1 million. You can't. It's topped out at $500 or something.
No, and it's not. There's no amount. But they keep going back to the advocates for bail reform, those that are more interested in the abuser rather than the victim. They'll show up in court, okay? And that's the key. That's their argument. So even if they've violated some orders, the judges have a little more discretion, but they still have to be reasonable. Now, let me go back to one thing. And we've talked about this before. The majority of violations that prior to bail reform, incarcerated individuals all happened out of Rikers. There are little or no incidents of abuse by bail throughout the state, no matter what anyone says. And so what they've tried to do is apply a rule that applies mostly to Rikers, which is a mess. Rikers is an absolute mess. But those that advocate bail reform, their answer to Rikers is close Rikers, tear it down, but don't build any communities. Just don't put anybody in jail. Okay. And it's gotten out of hand because people are either on one side of the issue or the other. And we've talked much about, let's come together, and there's been enough statistics that we could analyze, okay? So I think it's time to look at it. But as I said, when we talk about domestic violence, we need to segregate that. And Tom, I'm going to bring something up. And Stacy and I just did discuss some of this. There is a training exercise called In Her Shoes. Now, we're not being sexist, but 99% of the cases are.
I was going to ask that, Stacy. Is that true? Like 100% are male perpetrator, female and children victims? It's really a
Dominantly female, yes.
I mean, predominantly could be 80-20. This is like 99-1, isn't it?
Oh, well, 98-1, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
98.
Sorry, go ahead. It was really a male-female thing.
So this exercise called In Her Shoes is a moving parts exercise where you're broken up into different groups. And each group starts out in the home, and then there's a domestic violence incident. But different groups have different economic issues, different social status issues, different family issues. So they would send you to a different location in that room, and then you'd pick a card, and that would direct you to your next location. So let's take a typical example. You have an individual who's a victim with a child. They have no money. So where do they go? They can go to a shelter. But in some counties, the shelter is impossible to get to because of transportation issues, okay? Up in the North Country, sometimes it's 3 hours away and it's impossible. And then you can go to a shelter if there's one available, but you're limited on the amount of time in the shelter. Sometimes they'll give you some monies, you can go to a hotel, but then you're limited at the amount of time. Ultimately, most people end up back at home with the abuser because they've run out of options because, as Stacy said, there is not enough resources to protect the victims. And one of the most moving ones was after like 3 hours of movement to the room and going to different places and sleeping under a bridge with your child, the last stop, the morgue, because you've ultimately always gone back because of lack of resources. And I would suggest that maybe, Tom, in you have so little time during the day between this and your job, but take a look and see if you can research program In Her Shoes. I think you'd find that very, very interesting.
I would find it fascinating, but I'm not in that world. You know what I mean? Like the victims don't have time. They have less time than I do because they're victims, right, to actually step through intellectual exercises. Like I can understand it. I'm willing to pay more taxes. I can give it all to Stacy. But, I'm an aberration. I don't need to know more.
But if people don't understand the nuances, it becomes very difficult for them to advocate for adjustments to bail situations in a domestic violence situation, or the need for more funds to be put into resources. So the general public needs to know, because we need more than just a victim, the victim's family, or the advocates. And when you're on the bench as a judge, it's very difficult. It's unethical to advocate for one side or the other. So you have to remain neutral in those situations.
Yep.
So I take issue with your statement only to the effect that if the general public understood the nuances, they would probably be advocating for more funding for these programs.
40% of the general public thinks Donald Trump is the president. You can't tell me anything matters anymore. They're insane, the general public. So get him off, Mike. Get him off. I'll talk to Stacy.
Tom, 60% is the majority. So if we can get 60% to listen,
I didn't mean they voted for the guy. They still 3 years later think he's the president.
So I'm going to I want the other 60%. Forget that 40%. Stacy, go on.
Stacy, what in a perfect world, you're, the governor, the czar, or whatever. What do you need before bail reform and post bail reform? I don't want domestic violence. Like, I know we can't prevent it, but what can we do to temper this? Where do we put the guardrails and the bumpers and how do we help you more? I know nobody offers you that. That's why you come on Sunday. I offer you this.
I think it's important to talk about the charges that are at play for domestic violence and how we can change some of the judiciary discretion to keep some of the defendants in custody for a period of time that need to be in custody, to give victims time to leave a situation. There has been 44 of the 100 common domestic violence related charges removed from qualifying offenses for bail. So that in itself has limited us to reaching out to crime victims. So I don't know. We have We do a lot of fundraising. We are I'm county funded. There are grants for the remaining advocates. More grant funding would be helpful for more advocates, but at the end of the day, if the laws are not changed or something changes to compromise these laws, then our victims are going to stop reporting crimes. Because at the end of the day that have to deal with the defendant coming home and escalating that violence.
Last week I had a former prisoner on, and he said just at some point the light bulb went off. He served 26 years in state prison. And the light bulb went off, says, I've got to grow up here. I've got to get out of this cycle and I've got to get out of prison. And the light bulb went off. He became a whole different person and he changed and turned his life around and became, a contributor to society. How do we take the repeat offenders, even at the county level, and make them wake up and see that, I can't keep going on like that. It might be locking them up when they, continually do this until they say, yeah, I don't really want to be locked up anymore. But I mean, how do we mentally change people's minds that they shouldn't do this activity repeatedly and over and over? It probably takes some funding. It takes some education. It takes some outreach to everyone, which I think are all things you don't get money for anymore.
Yeah, you can talk to victims all day who say he just needs help or she just needs help. And that is something that definitely can be offered through the court system. Again, they don't get more funding based on this. So it really comes down to, if the defendant is provided that as an opportunity, they have to accept it. They have to choose to change. And at the end of the day, that may not be something that's worth risking for a victim. They have to be educated on the nuances of domestic violence and how defendants manipulate the system, how they manipulate them, and ultimately are a risk to their entire family. And the victim is the one that has to make the decision to leave and get out of that situation. So although programs are helpful, I don't know at the end of the day that they're going to keep victims safe.
And Assemblyman, you reside in the most liberal assembly, probably in the country, maybe California's more, but there's no temperature for increased funding to domestic violence agencies and preventative tasks.
The last few years, the budgets have held same as previous years, no increases. I think that with the new administration, there might be a voice for it. But let me add something that also that I faced when I was on the bench that I want to throw into this conversation. Because like I said, the purpose of today is to understand domestic violence that we can do within an hour and then apply that. I found that sometimes it was cultural. I had a case of an individual who the husband, and it was the husband, actually believed that he had a right to beat his wife. Mm-hmm. It was just cultural, and she had no right to refuse. I mean, so what ultimately happened is they kept coming in front of me, and finally she had the courage to go to trial. He was convicted of 2 separate misdemeanors. In order for her to have the ability to plan her escape, change her identity, and move to a undisclosed location, I had to give him 1 year on each consecutive, which meant I kept him in jail for close to 2 years, actually 20 months, which was enough time for her to change her life and take her children and move. I don't know where they moved. I know that the advocates assisted, but it was very shocking to see that a defendant actually said he has a right to beat his wife because it's cultural. So now I'm not trying to offend anybody or point fingers, but that is an actuality. And I think, Stacy, you might be able to support that also.
Stacy, yeah, is that a common, admittance? Not only am I not wrong, it's my right to do this. Who are you to tell me differently?
Absolutely. Those ones are sometimes the hardest to keep on board for cooperation because they are the most intimidated and the most fearful for their safety because they know how dangerous it is, and they are trained to believe that that's how they must live their lives.
Stacey, I think domestic violence might be one of the worst crimes that there is, really. And it's probably got many different components. It's got the judiciary and it's got, lots of things. What all components do you need us to work on? Who else should we bring to the table? We've now had the assemblyman was on. He brought the sheriff on. I had two former inmates on who are willing to work on this. One is sponsored by Microsoft in Seattle. I'd like us to solve this in Niagara Falls, in Niagara County. Like, we have all the talent. You are one of the smartest person I've ever met on this. Angelo is he returns every call. He's working as hard as he can be on this. And he doesn't think everything should just be abolished. He's willing to listen to everybody. Who else do we need at the table to talk about this?
I think we need a victim. And there are some victims that have had the courage. I don't have the names, but Stacey knows there's a few that are willing to share their stories.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that might be somebody we could bring on one time.
Stacey, he just put you on the hook. I'm salivating. I would love that show. Oh my God. If they would be strong enough to come on and talk honestly about that, we would be rocking the world, I think.
Yeah, I would just make sure that they have an advocate with them. Obviously, we do our best to explain all of the changes within bail reform, as well as all of the other changes that happen, discovery, code regulation changes with the court, et cetera, all those type of things that sometimes prevent immediate charges or result in not a full order of protection being issued. So I just want to make sure that they have all of the information before, I don't want to have misinformation go out, if that makes sense.
I'm not talking about a current victim or one that has cases pending, but there are a few that, and they're even in other states, that have been willing to come forward after their cases are over and actually explain from the inside what it feels like. So nobody local, nobody that is currently, but there are some out there. And I think that I might be able to track down at least one that I know has spoken before.
Okay, sure.
Is there a shaming situation going on where you're not shaming, but guilt? Like you're a victim, but if you come forward, all kinds of people are going to blame you. Your mother-in-law is going to be mad at you, or somebody's going to say you deserved it, God forbid. I mean, is there that in this? I mean, with drug use, it can be like that. Like, well, I was an addict once, so you're never going to believe me now if I admit it. Is there a domestic violence barrier there to open and honest communication? Because it seems like there might be.
Right. So that is often the case in many situations, especially, like I said, when the defendant or the abuser is a well-liked person. Sometimes when they have a lot of money or they're famous. Does everybody recall a recent viral video of an ex-NFL player that just girlfriend?
You cannot watch it. It's horrifying.
Did anybody read any of the comments blaming the victim for whatever she may have done to precipitate his being?
Wow, I did not. Wow, that's spooky.
Yeah. Those are the kind of things, and people are reading this every day. We're trying to promote awareness about domestic violence, and then things like that happen. People are correcting those comments online, but that still goes to show the kind of rhetoric that people are willing to go to protect somebody that they think is important and excuse that behavior.
I mean, I've been pulled over for a speeding ticket before, and I knew the guy, and he let me go. Does that ever happen in the domestic violence world? I mean, they come to my house and just don't do this again, and they don't let me go, but they don't arrest me. I mean, is there some privilege and favoritism that ever happens? No?
I've not seen that in any of my domestic cases. And I've been doing this for 10 years. So, I mean, we have taken police officers to court, attorneys to court, very wealthy people to court. So that's not been my experience, but I can understand that does happen. I just haven't seen that.
Angelo, on the training, Stacey just brought up a good point. You might not know, but you went through a lot of training as a judge. In this inane stupidity of defund the police, which is a stupid comment, and I don't think anybody even said it, but what training do the police get? They show up at a house and it can be a fire and it can be a dog bite and it can be a beating. Does a cop know? I wouldn't know what to do. What does a cop know when they show up and the woman is in distress and the man says she deserved it? How do they handle that? Are they trained?
I would answer this way, and it's not because I have specific knowledge, but before domestic violence, there was a focus on domestic violence. And I'm talking 15, 20 years ago, where it was just something that never got out of the house. People weren't talking about it.
Right.
It is my belief and my experience that the police dealt with the with the defendant, as any typical criminal act without understanding the nuances. Over the past number of years, and maybe the last 10 years, there's been more of a focus on educating law enforcement on the nuances of domestic violence. The police academies now specifically focus on it because, as we said when we began, it's not a mental illness and it's not a compulsion. It's a learned behavior. And we can go for days on the nuances of learned behavior. But so they have to understand that sometimes it's just what all the aspects of domestic violence, quote unquote, because like we said, there's no true definition, but they are given more sensitivity training on these issues. And unfortunately, bail reform has taken them out of that category of remove the abuser for a cooling off period, and it's sort of tied their hands. So they get a little frustrated, and I've talked to some of them since I've been off the bench, but they do their best to protect the victim. And, at some points, they even have taken the victim out of the house to protect the victim. Mm-hmm. And there are a couple of safe houses around. The cab drivers know where they're at. The advocates know where they're at, and they are monitored, they're secured, and many times we'll bring the victim and or the children, if there's children involved, to one of these safe houses until a safety plan can be put in place.
Mm-hmm. Many times they're full, sadly, too.
Absolutely, like Stacy said, we need more.
Have an on-call, and we are called out sometimes by supervisors and police agencies to find safe housing when somebody is available to go out. We do find that they're often full. It's not just because of COVID, because people need to get out and there's just not enough funding for housing, right? So that being said, our deputies are trained 14 hours of mandated domestic violence training, of which 4 of those hours are role play. So they're well versed in scenarios and given the tools to offer services and get a hold of victim advocacy agencies to provide that assistance. Like Assemblyman said, when you're charged with something that they know is going to be resulting in the defendant coming home by the next arraignment, which is hours away, it doesn't give the victim much time to make a plan.
Right. Sorry. Go ahead. I think when you were on with the sheriff, you had said something like, in the legislation that created bail reform, there were suggested or mandated public meetings and hearings to talk about this kind of stuff. I don't remember how you phrased that, but you said there hadn't been any yet.
There hadn't been any, and they did not consult with sheriff's departments. They did not consult with advocates. They did not consult with district attorneys. The only ones that my exposure and experience as the assembly member that those advocating bail reform consulted with were those of like minds. So they were closed-minded to the possibility of a open discussion on maybe modifying some of the changes. And if you recall, I said all of this emanated out of Rikers from one case. Now, I also would like people to understand, and we've said this before, there is what's called standards and goals. And when I was on the bench, once a month, we had to file a report as to how many cases were pending, felonies and misdemeanors, how many of them have been incarcerated and for how long. So I'm not going to deny that occasionally somebody would fall through the cracks. But for the most part, there are safeguards put in the system by the Office of Court Administration, by local courts, to protect those that were in jail longer than maybe they should have been, or they might have been reviewed. We also had situations where individuals would refuse to come to court. Many of the times, the bail would stay on them because they would refuse to come, whereas if they were to come in a cooperative manner, and I'm talking from the county jail, they then would have probably been able to be released at that point. So a lot of the discussions are misguided because they don't give you both sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, I'm going to ask each of you two different things. One thing each. Assemblyman, I want to have a segment and do this once in a while where I talk to somebody I don't like, that I just don't agree with, that there's nothing between us that can possibly make us, agree with each other. This isn't that case, but I do want to do that more often and just say, I don't understand you and I'd like to, I'd like to work through this. But maybe it would be helpful, just think about it, to have somebody from Albany who thought this was the best thing since sliced bread to clear out Rikers, to demolish Rikers. I'd love to talk to that person. I'd like to have them on and just say, educate us. We're in the other part of the state and I don't get it. What do you mean close Rikers? Where are we going to send these people? Let's have them talk. So you think about who we might.
One of the biggest advocates in Albany is Latrice Walker. She's a member out of, I think, the Bronx or Brooklyn, and she is one of the big advocates of this. Ocasio-Cortez has chimed in, but what has happened is, and unfortunately I didn't print it, but there was a report on Rikers they were saying everybody in there should be released because it's excessive bail. But it came down to, I believe, only 13% were there because of bail. The other were there because of heinous crimes. Mm-hmm. So they don't even give you the true facts. So, oh wait, I'm taking too much time. You got a question for Stacey?
But that's what I mean. Like, I'd like to understand that what they're thinking. Just let them talk. You know, if you think of anybody like that, either from downstate or anywhere, that might be helpful for us to listen to that person's logic, if we could. And then Stacey, I don't know what I like this topic of domestic violence in that we have to fix it somehow. I know no way to fix it. This isn't my world, but I do know that we need to talk about it to help fix it. So I know I'm right there, and I'm willing to talk about this as often as you will help me. You go away and think, if you can, of what kind of conversations would help and not hurt the situation. I don't want to inflame it. I want to solve it. Who do we bring to the table to understand each other? Victims and abusers. That's an ideal world, right? But how do we have a conversation? Because I know a conversation will help. If you could help me think that through, that'd be great.
I mean, in relation to bail reform or in general on domestic violence? Because
I think domestic violence. I think bail reform and non-bail reform. This has been with us, I think, right? The issue hasn't just come upon us with bail reform. So domestic violence would be my answer.
Domestic violence is not a economic issue for one group. It's not a cultural issue for one group. It's everybody's household. Everybody knows somebody that was affected by domestic violence, no matter where you come from, where you are, where you work. Everybody knows somebody affected by domestic violence. That being said, awareness about domestic violence and the services that are available to people who go through this are what's important. Outreach.
I guess I think of things like either the seatbelt law or even DWI. Like 40 years, 50 years ago, it was not thought of the same as it is today. Now, people in their 20s, 30s, they would never think of having a drink and getting behind the wheel. I mean, they just don't. They get designated drivers. 50 years ago, oh, well, you bump into something, you go home. So anyway, there was a big paradigm shift. I wish we could get to a paradigm shift on domestic violence. And I think through a campaign of talking about it with the right people who know more about the topic is a winning strategy.
Well, there's a recent shift in strangulation cases. So new studies have come out and people are advocating for strangulation to remain a felony and remove criminal obstruction of breathing from the penal code because it's not accurate. Anytime strangulation occurs, there is a 750% higher risk of homicide by that abuser. It's shown that abusers who strangle people are the most deadly people around. They're the ones who do the mass killing. They're the ones who shoot the police. They're the ones that commit the homicide. So it's very important to take strangulation seriously. And when criminal obstruction of breathing is on the list of acceptable offenses to charge, it's not charged enough. And people's lives are at risk because of it.
100 years ago, one of us on this screen couldn't even vote. One of us couldn't smoke in public. I mean, that's just nuts, right? So let's try and get to the point that 10 years from now, domestic violence is not acceptable. I mean, it's not acceptable now, but I don't think we're there because we haven't eliminated it. So anything I can do to help that, if you give it some thought after we're off the air, I would really appreciate it. I don't know what will, lessen this incidence of this, but I'd like to try and become part of the solution of it.
I'd love to help.
Stacy Seuss, Dr. Seuss, nothing? I mean, Dr. Seuss, did you get that all growing up? Are you any relation?
That's my married name. It's pronounced Cease, and we get.
Cease. Sorry, I mispronounced it. Maybe it was Dr. Cease, though. Maybe I've been pronouncing the book all wrong all these years. Assemblyman Moreno, thank you as always. Appreciate you. Thanks for helping on this. And you're not done. You're going to help again. So you're not off the hook.
Yes, we will talk over the next few weeks and figure out what else we can do. But on the bail reform, I'll come up with some names and contact info, but I'd rather you reach out to them. Okay?
I could reach out. I mean, somebody like AOC is never going to call me back.
No. But I'm talking more the assembly.
Somebody reachable. I'll reach out to them for sure. And I think it would also bring the state together. They don't need to think we're an unreachable part of their state. We are one state. I want to know them. They need to know us.
Yeah. It's funny. That's what I said when I first went there to some of the New York City people. And I said, if you don't talk to me, how am I going to know what your issues are?
Right.
You'll never learn my issues.
You're a dangerous person there because you're not an extremist. You don't do that. You don't say, I'm from here and this is what we do. You kind of just get along. It's your personality and it's a winning personality. You get in, you make friends with everybody and you listen to everybody. I mean, that's your value. Very valuable to have you there. Thank you.
Well, that's my job. My job is about the people in the 145th.
Oh, a lot of people have this job, but they're not doing it. They're not doing it like that.
Oh, thank you.
Stacy, thank you. Assemblyman, thank you. Have a great Sunday. Bills already won, so no go Bills, but
No,
do something.
next Monday, a week from Monday.
All right. Thanks again.
Take care, Tom. Take care. Stacy, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Of course.
Michael, thank you, Michael.